Last week, there were 6 tight ends that scored 18 or more fantasy points. That's the most this season. Out of those 6 tight ends, there were 3 that scored 20 or more fantasy points. Also the first time that's happened this season. Could the tight end position be coming in clutch to end the fantasy year? Man, I hope so, because there's a lot of people out there that could definitely use a huge boost at the position. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everybody is doing well out there today. We are going to be diving in to every single matchup on the slate this weekend and talking about the tight end position, trying to figure out whether or not we've got guys that we can throw in and start for high upside, some guys that we can put in our lineup because we know they offer a safe floor, or somebody that we're just risking it all for because we don't know what we're going to get from them, but maybe you don't have another choice. Y'all got to hit that like button for me, turn on the bell notifications. Anytime we drop content here on the Fantasy Headliners, you'll then know about it right away. And let's go ahead and hop into Thursday Night Football, where we might actually have a couple of guys that will be useful at the beginning of the week. Right now, the Chicago Bears allow the 5th most passing yards in the NFL, and they also allow the most fantasy points to the tight end position. Given the tough week that Bryce Young is just coming off of, it could very well be that the game plan for Chicago this week will be some high percentage throws, especially early on in the contest. Get his energy back, get him feeling confident in himself again, getting him moving the ball down the field. If we can accomplish all those things to begin the game, Hayden Hurst could definitely see a few targets at the very beginning of it, but I can't put him in green, even in a really good matchup, because he's just been way too disappointing for a majority of this season. He's definitely really risky to try and throw out there, and if it weren't such a good matchup, he would be in red. Cole Kmet has 18 targets over his past 2 games, more than any other tight end in football right now, and this matchup would be a great opportunity to toss him back into your lineup once again, because those targets could still come. But unfortunately, targets don't lead to fantasy points. After 10 receptions 2 weeks ago and 2 touchdowns last week, he's had a super high ceiling in back-to-back weeks now. But you have to keep in mind that this Carolina defense is really good at stopping the pass. Right now, they allow the 4th fewest passing yards per game and the 9th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. And one thing that the Chicago Bears will have going for them on Thursday Night Football is that Brian Burns has already been ruled out with a concussion. So the pass rush will definitely take a hit for Carolina. And Cole Kmet is really the exact opposite of Hayden Hurst, because if Hayden Hurst had a more difficult matchup, like I already mentioned, he would definitely be in red. Well, if Cole Kmet had a better matchup, he would definitely be listed in green. Now, it does look like Justin Fields is going to get back to practice this week, and Bagent will probably still start on Thursday Night Football. So I think we can count on a decent amount of targets for him yet again. But like I said, targets don't just equal fantasy points. We have to hope for maybe a touchdown or at least a couple of big plays from Cole Kmet this week and what will probably be his last week with Bagent at the helm. But sometimes being a little risky can work out better for our pick'ems than our fantasy team. And that's why with Hayden Hurst's current line of 14.5 receiving yards over on Underdog, I'm absolutely going to go hammer the higher pick on that one. And if you want to play this pick'em along with any of the other ones we talk about during the week, make sure you head on over to Underdog and use our code word to sign up, Headliners. They're going to match your first deposit up to $100, and you're going to get a special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit. And even though Hayden Hurst only had 2 receptions last week, one of them went for over 30 yards. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that he can find at least 1 reception that goes for over 15, and then we'll lock in the win at that point. Kylen Granson hasn't done much for the Indianapolis Colts this season. He's actually played in 1 less game than Alec Ogletree and 2 less games than Mo Alley-Cox, but yet he still has more targets than those 2 combined. It's just really unfortunate that the Colts haven't put him in a position to do anything with those targets either. He's not getting a ton of looks right now. Several guys are ahead of him. Maybe with Josh Downs being out, he could see a few more targets this week. But unfortunately, in this matchup, going up against the New England Patriots, who allow the 10th fewest fantasy points to the position, I'm going to go ahead and stay away from him in week 10. However, the Indianapolis Colts allow the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends, which means I am firing up Hunter Henry once again. His 7 targets this past week is the first time that he's eclipsed 5 targets since week 2. And with no more Kendrick Bourne, it really does look like that any type of negative game script is going to put Hunter Henry near the top in targets on the team. Now, he may not have a ton of big days in terms of receiving yards, but we've known through all of training camp and for the first couple of weeks of this season, he was the go-to guy for Mac Jones. Now that Mac Jones is kind of cemented in place as the starter once again, he had a few up and downs there a few weeks ago. It feels like that Mac Jones is going to be going back to Hunter Henry quite a bit, and his touchdown upside will be great every single week. David Njoku and Mark Andrews is going to be a really fun matchup to watch, except they're playing 2 of the toughest defenses in the NFL against tight ends. Right now, Cleveland allows the fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. Baltimore, they allow the 4th fewest points to the tight end position. For David Njoku, it's really been nice to see Cleveland utilize him more in the passing game. Over the last 3 games, he's seen 9, 8, and 6 targets. And even with Deshaun Watson being back this past week, David Njoku was still able to find the end zone for a 2nd straight game and saw 6 targets as well. That continues to be my main concern with David Njoku. Since Deshaun Watson took over as quarterback, they really haven't looked his way all that often. He's been more of a red zone threat. If we can keep David Njoku right around 6 to 7 targets a week, it's really going to do a lot for his fantasy value and make him a guy that we could start every single week. Now, this matchup is not going to be great for him. If Baltimore plays the way that their offense has been lately, then Cleveland could find themselves in some negative game script, meaning that David Njoku could keep up with those targets. If he doesn't see the big play or the touchdown, then his fantasy upside will end up being limited this week, and that's why he brings some risk. Mark Andrews is going to continue to be a guy that is super safe regardless of how high his ceiling is in a tough matchup like this against Cleveland. Yeah, he might not be a guy that finishes as a top 5 tight end this week, but he sees more than enough volume in this new Baltimore passing attack to definitely be a guy that's safely inside the top 12 every week. So if you have Mark Andrews this week, you're absolutely going to be playing him. Should you be a little bit worried about the upside that he'll present for you? Of course, because this is a really tough matchup and Cleveland's defense is strong as can be. But for Andrews, as long as he sees anywhere between 5 to 8 targets, he should put up more than enough receiving yards to still give you a really nice floor. After a down performance a couple of weeks ago, Dalton Schultz was right back at it last week in a historic performance from CJ Stroud. And now he's going up against the Cincinnati Bengals that allow the 4th most fantasy points to the tight end position. And you better bet that Houston will have to pass the ball quite a bit once again, going up against this Cincinnati offense that's looking a whole lot better over the last few weeks. Dalton Schultz is really going to be utilized heavily in this game, I feel like, and is a really strong start candidate for me against a defense that allows a lot of plays to the tight end. And even though Irv Smith Jr. scored last week and has a nice matchup here again, I'm not banking on it. I'm not really worried about what Irv Smith Jr. can and can't do. They are playing some 2 tight end sets. They're rotating their tight ends in and out. He got lucky with a touchdown. He saw 2 catches on that first drive last week, including a touchdown, and didn't see another catch again until the end of the game. That shows you just how volatile Irv Smith Jr. could be. I want you all to tell me if this isn't one of the most frustrating game logs that we've read all season long. In order, finishing is the tight end 27, the tight end 32, then the tight end 5, then back down to the tight end 45, and then back up to the tight end 1, and then back down to the tight end 51, and back up to the tight end 8, and then even higher to the tight end 3. Mama said George Kittle's like a box of chocolates. You just never know what you're gonna get. And that might be the worst Forrest Gump impression of all time, but I'm not here to do impressions. I'm here to help you set your fantasy lineups. And for George Kittle, trying to play him on a weekly basis is definitely enough to cause you some heartbreak heart palpitations. And coming off 18 targets the last 2 weeks, you would think he would make his way into the green. Especially considering the fact that Jacksonville allows the 7th most fantasy points to the tight end position. But herein lies the problem. Deebo Samuel is back at practice, and if he were to be back in the game this week, it definitely could take away quite a bit of targets for George Kittle, and that's really where he has excelled the last couple of weeks. So while you're going to want to throw him out there in your lineup, and I suggest that you still do if you own him, because let's face it, if you have George Kittle on your roster, you probably don't have a better option. And if you do, a more consistent option, I would recommend maybe going with them. For those of you that don't have a better option, George Kittle is absolutely the play. Really nice ceiling, super crappy floor. Evan Engram started the season with 4 straight top 12 performances as a tight end, and then he hasn't hit it since then. He has been close. He's finished as the tight end 14, 14, and 13 over the last 3 weeks. And unfortunately, he just isn't finding much of a ceiling right now, even though his target value is absolutely insane. Since week 1, Evan Engram hasn't seen less than 7 targets in a game. After week 1, he went 4 straight games with 8 targets, 2 straight games with 7, and then he finished with 10 targets 2 weeks ago prior to the bye. And while San Francisco may be very tough against the tight end, allowing only the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to them, it definitely bodes well to still see kind of the same stat line we have the last couple of weeks, where maybe he has a decent amount of targets, not a ton of yards, and unfortunately doesn't score a touchdown again, which would put him right outside the top 12. But you know what? You might be saying, Kyle, it's really weird that you're going to put a guy in green, even though if you don't know he can finish as a top 12 option. Well, once again, green just doesn't mean highest upside or start or sit or anything like that. It means safety. And Evan Engram is getting so many targets right now. He's one of the safest tight ends in all of football, because yeah, he may not get you 15, 18, 20 points in a week, but he's going to be right around 10 fantasy points, and you won't lose your week because you took a 0 in the tight end spot. I mean, you can test it if you want to and smell it for yourself, but there's no alcohol in here. It's just water. I'm not drunk. Taysom Hill's name is actually in green this week. And I really don't know what else to say about the guy other than the fact that he's absolutely going off right now. And if you've been around this show for the last couple of years, you already know my gripe with Taysom Hill and having him listed as a tight end in fantasy football. I still don't agree with it, because he's not really a tight end. He's more of like a hybrid type of running back that splits out. If you listed him as a running back, I would be okay with that, but not really tight end. But whatever he's listed at, he's still scoring points, and he's scoring a lot of them over the last 4 weeks. In fact, he's really the only thing that's consistently working right now for the New Orleans Saints. So for them to stop utilizing him would be the dumbest move in the world. Oh, that's right. Dennis Allen is their head coach. Yeah, it could absolutely happen this week, but it could absolutely happen any week. And Taysom Hill is one of the most volatile players that you can find in fantasy football right now, because he puts together a string of games like we've seen over the last couple of weeks where he's literally winning the tight end position because of what he does all over the field. And then all of a sudden he'll put a string of games together like he did at the beginning of the year, where the dude's barely scoring a few fantasy points per game. Anytime you start Taysom Hill, you know you're taking a risk. There's a lot of risk associated with him. But given his utilization as of recent, I am willing to finally say he's not nearly as risky as a lot of the other tight ends right now. And due to his upside, you should absolutely be starting him over anybody that's not named Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, TJ Hawkinson, or Mark Andrews. I will toss Juwan Johnson's name out here real quick. We're not starting him right now because we need to see some more consistent production, but it was good to see him back to being a red zone threat this past week, because that's what he does best. That's going to bring some very volatile games along with it, but if he starts scoring touchdowns and being utilized in the red zone a lot more often, then maybe he becomes the guy that we start throwing into our lineup on a weekly basis. I feel like I called last week to an absolute T with TJ Hawkinson, because I even even brought up the fact, hey, this is a guy that could see a lot of targets this week and probably catch a lot of those targets. But he could end up having under 10 yards per reception, and he may not put up 70, 80, 90 yards and not score a touchdown, but still do enough to be fantasy viable. And last week was a really good week for tight ends. On normal weeks, TJ Hockenson would have been inside the top 12. Last week, not so much. If you played in a PPR league, it worked out great. Half PPR league, it worked out just fine. Standard league, not so much. But we're still continuing to throw him out there. Josh Dobbs, probably going to be starting at quarterback this week. And once again, we'll be looking towards TJ Hockenson more times than not. We saw the big play touchdown for Luke Musgrave last week, and he continues to be a tight end that we know can make big plays. But why Green Bay doesn't give him any more volume continues to be a mystery to me. And maybe going up against this pass rush from Pittsburgh, they'll start to get in the ball a little bit more if Jordan Love can't stay in the pocket that long. But even if that does happen, this is a really tough matchup for tight ends. The Steelers currently allow the 5th fewest passing yards to the tight end position and the 6th fewest receptions. A majority of the damage that teams do to them is at the wide receiver position. So Luke Musgrave has a tall task in front of him if he's going to be fantasy viable this week. And once again, it's probably going to be based around whether or not he can make a big play. If he can, and if he can find the end zone, he'll be in the top 12. But if not, it's hard to imagine that he'll have enough volume to get him there. We won't be looking towards Casey Hayward as a fantasy option this week, but this is a reminder that Pat Freiermuth is eligible to come off the IR next week. And if that happens, he's definitely a guy that we'll be looking at moving forward. Make sure you check your waiver wires for him. If he's available, picking him up and stashing him could end up benefiting you in the long run. Last week, I gave you a couple of shot in the dark tight ends that if you put them into your lineup, they could end up surprising you, but they brought a lot of risk with them. Last week, one of them was Cade Otton, and I had him listed in yellow. This week, his opponent, Chigioco, I'm going to say the same thing about him. I'm not risking anything on it. I'm probably not even throwing him in my lineup unless I'm desperate for it. But this could end up being the week that we see a decent Chigioco performance. Treylon Burks is expected to miss this week, which means Chigioco could pick up a few more targets. I do think Kyle Phillips still can end up being that secondary option for Will Levis, but Chigioco may not be that far behind them, especially considering the fact that he's going up against a Tampa Bay defense that isn't all that great against the pass and against tight ends especially. Tampa Bay allows the 7th most receptions and the 8th most receiving yards to tight ends on the season. And since they've only allowed 2 touchdowns, they are still allowing the 10th most fantasy points. So from that perspective, they're not giving up a ton of big plays and they're not giving up a ton of scores to the tight ends. But that's all right. This week, Chigioco, if we could get him like 5 or 6 targets, he could put together enough yards to just be on the outside of the top 12 tight ends. Me personally, I'm thinking like 6 targets, 4 receptions, and 50 yards. That may not be enough, but if you can get that one big catch, it could boost him just a little bit higher into the top 12. Cade Otton had a fantastic week last week. My shot in the dark play, if you were looking for somebody to get into your lineup that could offer you some potential, the dude went off. And the biggest thing about Cade Otton right now is he's playing more snaps than any tight end in football. This guy is on the field 90% of the time, actually over that at this point. So when you take a look at Cade Otton, the opportunity absolutely is there. And given the matchup last week, that's why we took a look at it. But this matchup, going up against Tennessee, that allows the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the tight end position, it's just not worth going after. Tennessee allows the 4th fewest receptions and the 7th fewest receiving yards to tight ends this season. But the fun fact here, Tennessee is the only defense in the NFL to not allow a touchdown to a tight end yet this season. And they've played some pretty decent tight ends. Mark Andrews is even on that list. So when you slow down tight ends like that, going up against a guy like Cade Otton that's been super inconsistent this year, he was great last week. I'm not expecting much this week though. I don't think anyone would blame us if we put the entire Atlanta offense in red. Arthur Smith is trying to outsmart everybody. But the problem is he's only outsmarting himself because I mean, we're giving Jonnu Smith carries at the goal line over Bijan Robinson. It just doesn't make sense what he's trying to do. Kyle Pitts is going to be in red for me this week. The dude couldn't even get a decent amount of targets last week with no Drake London, and Drake London is back at practice. It felt like Jonnu Smith was the #1 target last week, and then really, Taylor Heinicke just spread the ball everywhere else. And my hope is that Bijan Robinson, he can even get a little bit more involved in the passing game this week. So for Kyle Pitts, there isn't a whole lot that I want to do with him right now, because outside of like a couple of good weeks, he just isn't giving you anything fantasy viable. For Jonnu Smith though, I will go back to him. Last week I talked about Jonnu Smith maybe not being the guy, because in the past, Taylor Heinicke has really not looked at his tight end position. But that was not the case last week, as he was firmly locked on Jonnu Smith, who had a huge play to go with it. For me, I feel like we're going back to Jonnu Smith this week. He's got some risk with him, but I do think he sees enough targets to present a pretty decent floor. Atlanta's pretty good against the pass, allowing the 10th fewest passing yards this season, but they are allowing quite a bit of points still to the tight end position. And hopefully with Kyler Murray back this week, we might see some more consistencies with the passing offense, even though he's missed quite a bit of time, obviously, returning from that ACL last year. I'm not expecting Kyler Murray to be super sharp. I'm expecting him to make some mistakes, but I'm not expecting him to run a whole lot this week. So the one thing I do think could happen is a nice amount of targets to Trey McBride. Get the ball out quickly. Don't really let Kyler Murray get knocked around in the pocket all that often. In the last couple of years, Kyler Murray has loved looking to Zach Ertz. He didn't really utilize his tight ends before that, but Trey McBride, this isn't his first rodeo either. He's not a rookie. So hopefully he's had some time with Kyler Murray, and Kyler Murray can trust him maybe a little bit more than what he does some of the other wide receivers. I don't see a huge ceiling for Trey McBride this week, but I still think he can be serviceable. My Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week is going to be Detroit at the LA Chargers, and this matchup is going to be lit. And yes, I'm talking about Sam LaPorta. And with the holidays coming up, head on over to manscaped.com, because they've got a ton of new formulas and new tools that you can use as stocking stuffers or gifts for that special person in your life. Manscaped.com, code word headliners, you're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. Maybe I'm getting a little bit too hyped up, and maybe I'm propping Sam LaPorta up a little bit too much as well. But right now, the Los Angeles Chargers are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to the tight end position. But it's the sheer amount of volume that tight ends are getting against the Chargers. They're allowing the 4th most receptions and the 2nd most receiving yards to tight ends this year. And since there's no Travis Kelce, we need a new tight end 1 this week. And you know what? I'm making this my Manscaped must-watch matchup, because I'm putting Sam LaPorta at tight end 1 this week. This dude could end up being in for a huge game in what could be a big back and forth between two really good offenses. Last week, Gerald Everett struggled to get anything going against the New York Jets. The defense just was all over him, and Justin Herbert seemed flustered all night long. It took a special teams touchdown, and it took a couple of rushing touchdowns from Austin Eckler to get the job done. Now, the New York Jets passing defense can be a little bit more frustrating than the Lions, so I do expect Gerald Everett to get a little bit more involved, knowing that there's no Josh Palmer again, and of course Mike Williams is still out as well. Maybe Quentin Johnson starts going, but I'm still holding out hope that Gerald Everett can have himself a really nice volume day, even if he doesn't score a touchdown. I really wanted Daniel Bellinger to become a thing last year, and it didn't happen. And then I really wanted Daniel Bellinger to become a thing this year. And then they traded for Darren Waller. So now I'm getting my third shot. 3 strikes and you're out. Daniel Bellinger is definitely in a position to kind of try and establish himself as a playmaker in this offense. Now, what does that mean moving forward? We don't know how long Darren Waller is going to be missing for. And at this point, the New York Giants season is basically over with. So why don't we find out what we have with some of this young talent? Maybe we start running some more 2 tight end sets with Bellinger and Waller next year. Last week, 43 yards on only 3 receptions. Bellinger does have a knack for getting some big plays from time to time. This matchup is not great. So unfortunately, I'm not probably going to risk it with him this week. But for those of you out there that don't love your tight end situation, keep an eye on Bellinger because he may be somebody that we pick up sooner rather than later. And thank you to the fantasy gods for finally giving us something that we've asked for, because how many weeks have I been telling you all now? If we give Jake Ferguson the volume, he will produce. And he had a huge week last week with 10 targets, catching 7 of those. Honestly, Jake Ferguson should be right around 7 to 10 targets every single week. CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson, and then Tony Pollard. If the Cowboys are doing anything different, they're not doing the right thing. Jake Ferguson needs to be a bigger part of this game plan. Now, the New York Giants defense, they have done a good job of limiting tight ends so far this season. So do I expect a huge ceiling from Jake Ferguson? Until we start to see more consistent volume and not just weeks at a time, then at that point, we'll put him back to green. But for right now, he's still going to bring a little bit of risk with a pretty decent upside. Over the past 3 weeks, it does feel like Washington is trying to slow the game down a little bit for Sam Howell and set him up for high percentage throws. Now, I still don't love their game plan. It still feels like they come out gunning way more often than they should instead of running the football with Brian Robinson a little bit more, but it is what it is. And if they keep throwing the football, that's good for Logan Thomas. At least 6 targets in his last 3 games. So it feels like he's becoming a more consistent part of the game plan. He hasn't really reached a ceiling as of yet. When you play Logan Thomas, you're really hoping for like 8 fantasy points. That's really kind of where his ceiling lies. But if he continues to get 6 targets a week, then you're looking at a floor that puts him right around 6 fantasy points. It's not a great wide margin, but it's more than enough to stick him in your lineup if you're looking for a guy to get you through the bye week or injuries. And that's really what Logan Thomas has become. He's not really a great, hey, let's play Logan Thomas because we think he has a great matchup. He's more of a great, hey, let's play Logan Thomas because I really don't have anybody else and I don't want to take a 0. Much like the other guy, Noah Fant, would give you, because there's just no utilizing tight ends in Seattle right now. You've got DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jake Bobo, Jackson Smith-Njigba. All of them are seeing looks through the air. Kenneth Walker is even getting a couple of targets a game. You got Zach Charbonnet getting a couple of targets a game. So really the tight ends right now, unless there's like a big play or a touchdown, they're just not fantasy viable. I'm going to be real with y'all. There's really not a whole lot to talk about in this matchup. Tyler Conklin didn't have a bad week last week. 6 receptions, 66 yards, but he's splitting with essentially 2 other tight ends, and his reduced role is not allowing for a ton of upside. I mean, he didn't even finish as a top 12 tight end last week with those numbers. And while those numbers would be good if they were consistent, they're not, so we can't bet on them. And for Michael Mayer, everybody got excited a couple of weeks ago when the dude went wild on one drive of one game. And at that point, like I tried to tell y'all to pump the brakes and be careful for what it means moving forward. We added him up, we listed him as a risky start, and it still hasn't turned into anything for him. Now that we've got Aiden O'Connell at the helm of things, they're running the football a lot with Josh Jacobs. Jacoby Myers is getting the targets, and so is Devontae Adams. Michael Mayer right now is really not a risky start that we want to roll with either. Both of these guys in this matchup should actually be on waivers. Well, at least there's one tight end to talk about on Monday Night Football, and no, it's not Adam Troutman. It's Dalton Kincaid, who's absolutely playing insane right now at the tight end position. 3 straight weeks of top 12 performances, and he's really being utilized much better in this offense now that Dawson Knox is missing time with that wrist injury. And the volume is going to pair really, really nice with his potential upside this week, because Denver allows some huge plays to the tight end. Denver allows the 9th most receptions to the tight end position, but they allow the most receiving yards to the tight end position. So even though he might not be building up a ton of receptions, he could be building up some huge yards in this matchup. We know Dalton Kincaid can definitely break a big play here or there. So this week could definitely be the breakout performance that we've been waiting for from Dalton Kincaid. He's been playing really well as of late, but we're talking like top 3 potential in this one. Yo, Headliners, I appreciate you for tuning in to another episode here on the Fantasy Headliners, my start and sit analysis for the tight end position here in Week 10. Hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, turn on the bell notification so anytime we go live or drop new content, you're gonna know about it right away. Headliner Nation, y'all need to stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Nah.